Welcome to Hope Church Online. It's going to be a great day today. We've got John giving us a talk on the gift of prophecy, and then we'll have some worship. So for now, I just want you to take a deep breath in and be open to what it is that John has to share today. So over to him.
We've been talking about one of our values as Hope Church, that hope grows in encounter. And we have an expectation that the gifts of the Spirit will be apparent amongst us. And we've been talking about this in quite broad strokes to start off with, and now we're getting down to the specifics. And today I'm going to speak to you about prophecy. But even then, prophecy is a massive subject. I'm not going to be covering everything, but there are some specifics I want to talk about. So firstly, what is prophecy? See, if you maybe aren't a Christian, then you might think prophecy was about predicting the future. You know, what are the lottery numbers? But although there is an element of foretelling to prophecy, it is so much more than that. And I like that word more. But simply, I would say this. Prophecy is at its most fundamental meaning a message from God. Hence, to prophesy is to declare a message from God. Now, before I was a Christian, I'd go to spiritualist meetings, I've been to see mediums, been to seances, and I've heard messages from somewhere. And I'll just need to tell you straight away, they were not messages from God. And they are not. Completely they're not. They are counterfeit. They are powerless. They have no power. They are a distraction. They are a false hope. And they are dangerous. Stay away from those things. But back to that true prophecy, I would like to give a fuller and deeper, more definition to it. So, real prophecy declares the mind, the message of God, which sometimes predicts the future, which is foretelling, and more commonly speaks forth his message for a particular situation, which is forthtelling. And these two terms come across, if you're ever studying prophecy, quite often. It's foretelling and forthtelling. So foretelling, predicting the future. Forthtelling, speaking forth God's message into the situation. I love that. So all through the Old Testament, we can read from Genesis to Malachi the foretelling of the coming of Jesus Christ. At the heart of the Old Testament, running like a massive vein through it all, is the prophecy that the Messiah will come. And for so many, including myself, it's an amazing testimony and reassurance to read that prophetic voice throughout the Old Testament. And it is another reminder to us all of how important prophecy is, and that element of foretelling. Jesus himself, when he actually then got here, he prophesied, and so much of what he said was foretelling. For instance, with the destruction of the temple, he said he was quite specific about the way even it would be destroyed. And Jesus also, of course, he prophesied his own death and resurrection, which I'll touch on a bit later as well. So foretelling was in the Old Testament, continued through Jesus, and into the New Testament. If you go into the book of Acts, there's a prophet called Agabus, and he predicts a coming famine. He foretells the arrest of Paul. As we move further into the New Testament, we come to the book of Revelation, which is a prophetic book, and it's a book of foretelling, as well as maybe forthtelling. I'll leave that with you. But so we have this foretelling seam all the way through the Bible, and yet we also have this forthtelling as well. God's message spoken forth into specific situations. Now that was done on a very general or large scale. So many words of the Old Testament prophets are taken up, calling out to the people of Israel and even to other nations to change their ways. And yet also declaring messages of hope and reassurance and restoration. And at times, the prophets also spoke specifically to individuals with that same terms. They would call people back, calling them out, like with the prophet Nathan and David, when David was very naughty with Uriah the Hittite and Bathsheba and the way he acted there, Nathan came along and he said, you need to sort it out, David. And then you had, for instance, a relationship between Isaiah and Hezekiah, which was also a relationship of reassurance and comfort. Words from Isaiah gave to Hezekiah. They comforted him. So we have this all the way through, that God will foretell. He'll speak into these certain situations, and sometimes they are messages of hope, but sometimes they can sound a bit scary, what God's saying. And I believe that God still speaks in those ways to us today. And yes, that can sound, me saying that can sound a bit scary, that God's going to speak so clearly into our lives. What might that look like? I remember going to a meeting with a prophet. I went to meet up with this prophet, and I was scared. I was sure that this prophet was going to see all my failures, all of my bad habits, and he was going to get this big spotlight and shine it on me and say, you're not good enough, you who lack righteousness. Well, I am righteous actually, but I'm not self-righteous. I'm made righteous by what Jesus has done. This is the deal, that's not the prophet's job. Now there was a prophet. I had this story about this prophet in the Catholic Church, and a cardinal was asked to go and check out if she was the real deal. And so he went and met with her, and he said to her, okay, so you feel God speaks to you sometimes? She says, yeah, me and God, he comes to me and speaks to me sometimes, and have this conversation with him. And he says, okay, so next time this happens, can you ask him, what did he say? What did I say in my last confession? So prophet's like, okay. And the cardinal goes away, and a little while later comes back to meet with the prophet and says to the prophet, have you spoken to God about me? And the prophet's like, yeah, I did. And did you ask him about what I said in my last confession? Yeah, I did. Oh. The cardinal got a bit scared, and the cardinal said, well, what did God say about what I said in my last confession? And the prophet said, oh, God said he can't remember. He can't remember. See, when God has dealt with who we were. He's dealt with who we were. It says his sins are as far as the east is from the west from me. Who we were has been dealt with. God's interested in what we are becoming. He's interested in how he can encourage us onwards. God is love, and his intention in any of his words spoken over us will have the intention of building us up, not knocking us down. God's intention for his people then and now was to see them thrive. That is still his intention, to call us out to be what we were created to be. And as we move into the New Testament and look at some of those forth-telling words of Jesus, it's the same theme. So we get words Jesus saying this, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. How's that prophetically forth-telling? This is Jesus speaking to a tax collector. This is a guy who's a rogue. He's on the other part, excluded from society. And Jesus says, today I'm coming to your house. Where's the message that? Well, you can hear it loud and clear today. It's this message that says, wherever you're at, I want to come in. I want to enter into where you're at now, wherever that would be. In John chapter 4, Jesus speaks to a Samaritan woman. And the Samaritan woman, they're talking about water, and she says, God, Jesus, give me that water so I'll never thirst no more. And Jesus says, go and get your husband. She says, I haven't got a husband. And Jesus says, I know. You've had 5 husbands, and the man you're living with now is not your husband. That's forth-telling. Jesus is saying, you're thirsting for life, or you're looking for it in the wrong direction. Come to me. Forth-telling. Speaking into that woman's situation specifically. This is the way Jesus works, where God works. He's speaking into our situation and wanting to meet with us. He has a message for us. And so we come to 1 Corinthians chapter 14 verse 3 and we read these words. But the one who prophesies speaks to people for their strengthening, encouraging and comfort. And even in that, I believe that is a forth-telling statement. When we speak that message, that word into someone's life, into their situation, it is a message coming forth from God to strengthen, encourage and comfort. That is what we're called to do in the same way Jesus has shown us to do, in the same way his word shows us to. I believe the greatest culmination of the prophetic in both the terms of foretelling and forthtelling is actually found at the Last Supper. And actually not just in the Last Supper, but in that journey to the cross and the cross itself. It is in Jesus saying, when he is breaking the bread and pouring out the wine, this is my body, this is my blood, and he's literally talking about this is his body which is going to be broken. He's tearing his bread, but it's his hands he's tearing it with are going to be broken soon. Pouring this wine, he's saying, this is my blood, but soon his blood will be shed. The prophetic message from Christ is personal, and yet it goes out to the world. It is foretelling, this is what's going to happen, and yet it's forthtelling. It is speaking into the situation of every human being on earth. It says, this is what's going to happen. I am going to die. And yet this is the message that God is speaking into every situation. Jesus, I am going to be broken and bleed and die, but I'm going to do that for you. This is what's going to happen, and this is God's message to you. For God so loved the world that he gave his own one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. In Jesus we find the complete fulfillment of prophecy, the embodiment himself of prophecy, because if prophecy is a message from God, in Jesus, in God incarnate, we find he came and delivered himself as that message. Both foretelling and forthtelling. And that foretelling from the Old Testament up to Christ, and then from Christ up until this day, throughout the history of the church, that has continued. It has continued a continuous basis, as I said, throughout the history of the church. But with problems. And I think it's important that we look at the problems. We don't ignore or sweep things under the carpet. We look at things head on. So the problem with prophecy, just basically, is it can be abused and people get stuff wrong. That's it generally. There's other things maybe come off of that, but generally, this is it. It can be abused and people get stuff wrong. See, they didn't have as much problem with getting foretelling wrong in the Old Testament times, because you weren't really going to volunteer, because if you got it wrong, unless you really knew, because if you got it wrong, you get stoned to death. Fortunately, that doesn't happen anymore. But you will find lots of times of forthtelling into situations where it was just false prophets, especially telling kings what they wanted to hear, speaking falsely into situations. These types of instances really do prophecy no favours. The abuse and getting it wrong even. It doesn't, unfortunately. Even right up to today, there's been huge issues in American circles around the amount of prophets who predicted that Donald Trump would be re-elected. Some very famous prophetic voices got it very wrong. Let's be full of grace. The problem with all of us is we carry our own thoughts and feelings and desires, and sometimes, especially if we're prophesying, we can get them mixed up with what God is saying. So I've been told by a prophet that I know, they said to me it's easy for her to prophesy over someone who they don't know because they don't have all that interference. When we prophesy, be aware of that interference, because the other area where prophecy gets it wrong is abuse, and it can be easy to put our own spin on something we are sharing. And there are those who will simply abuse prophecy for their own ends, and there will be those who do it a bit of a sideways prophecy thing in a way of hoping that they are helping someone along. And when I mean like sideways prophesying, in the same way sideways praying, I pray that John is more generous and learns to give to those closest to him in need. That sounds like an honest prayer, unless the person praying it is close to me and in need. You can see where I'm going. See, it's the same as prophecy. As a church leader, for instance, there's a position open to abuse people by prophesying them to do whatever I want. I believe that God is telling you to sell that really expensive thing that I don't think you really need and give the money to the church because we're skint. We're not skint. That's not something I'm going to do. That's not what we're about. But you can see where the temptation can come in. Discernment is the key to receiving prophecy. Weigh it. Take it to God. Take it to people you trust. If it is against God or His word especially, chuck it out. But be careful with that as well. I've had people say to me, God wouldn't ask you to do that. And then I read the Bible and there's this prophet Isaiah wandering around for 3 years naked because God told him to, or Hosea marrying a prostitute because God told him to. Those sorts of things should make you pause. Seriously, when you receive prophecy, take time to discern it. The greatest problem that's come with the prophetic in the church over the last 2,000 years of prophecy has been in terms of excess and restraint. In John 4:23-24, we read this: "Yet a time is coming and has now come when the true worshippers will worship the Father in the Spirit and in truth. For they are the kind of worshippers the Father seeks. God is Spirit, and His worshippers must worship Him in the Spirit and in truth." And actually, that was spoken by Jesus, that woman at the well in Samaria. At many times in history, prophecy has got a bit out of hand. And you might be tempted to say, how does prophecy get out of hand? Well, surely just people being led by the Spirit. Well, I'll tell you what, there have been times when people have got so caught up prophesying, they've forgotten the truth and how they live that out. Unfortunately, it's easy. People have got caught up in ego. People have ended up prophesying about prophecy after prophecy and they've forgotten what they originally prophesied about. People got lost in little spirit-filled rabbit holes, got distracted, driven to excesses, and most dangerously, when it comes to truth, they have veered from the Word of God. And this has happened most impressively, if that's the right word, as far as I can see historically. The 2nd to 4th centuries they had issues like this. In the 16th and 17th century had this, and then in the 20th century right up to now this does happen. For instance, for example of a modern situation, currently in South Africa there are over 10,000 denominations in that country, 10,000 Christian denominations. Most of these would be African independent or initiated churches. And what happens, they are dividing and dividing and dividing. Why do they divide? Well, this is the usual reason. A new prophet rises up and takes part of that church away or starts their own. There is obviously a complex history to that situation, which does have its basis in colonial idiocy, but you can see where I'm coming from. It's where we can get a bit lost. See, and then we have these excesses throughout church, and this causes the next problem: excess, restraint, times of restraint, Anywhere in history, just look at any historical revolutions are a great place to look at this. Times of excess are usually followed by times of over-restraint. In trying to take back control of situations, different things are quashed completely. And I think that has happened to some respect to the church in this country. We have had times when the prophetic flowed, ego and self-promotion, and people jumping on the bandwagon, people seeing opportunities for their own voice to be heard rather than the voice of God, people wanting to read extremely long bits of the Bible from church, like I'm going to read Psalm 119 today. And the church leaders responded with restraint, and maybe that went too far. But now, especially at this time in history, I believe that God is wanting those doors back open. There are messages to bring to God's people, messages to the world to encourage, strengthen and comfort. Let's prophesy. We are not all prophets, but we can all prophesy. We are all called via the Great Commission to make disciples of all nations, to share the good news of Jesus Christ. We're not all evangelists. Billy Graham had an anointing as an evangelist, and look what he did. But we are all called to evangelize. In the same way, there will be those anointed as prophets and will be able to speak into situations and movements in ways that others can't. But we can all prophesy. And as it says, 1 Corinthians 14 again, verse 1, eagerly desire the gifts of the Spirit, especially prophecy. Because we can all encourage, strengthen and comfort, and we all need encouragement, strength and comfort. I remember about 11 or 12 years ago, the church had a place, a church in this had a place in town called Number 11. And there we had this prayer room. And Tanya had this idea that we would get an envelope for every person in church, and we'd put their name on it and encourage everyone else to visit the prayer room to prophesy over someone. And just in case, Tanya put a message for everyone in every envelope. She went through every single person in church and she prayed over and gave a message to everyone. No one got missed out. And you know, that week more people visited that prayer room than before. And I'm going to be cynical here. I'm not sure if it was more people with words to give. I suspect it was more of, like myself, I was one of these, wanting to find out if somebody had a word for me. If God had a message for me, somebody had prophesying to me. I became personally obsessed, checking in all the time. I love the fact that God speaks to us. And I'm desperate to hear anything that he might be saying to me. And I know so many of us want that. We'll get that. If we can embrace that as part of our culture, take personal responsibility to say to God, have you got a word today for someone? It isn't about the most spiritual person, you know, it's not, oh, well, he must be so in touch with God. You know, people will see me quite often up the front in church and I'll be, you know, I'll bring a word I think God's got for the church. And you say, oh, it's just John, innit? You know what? Because on a Sunday morning and through the week, actually, I'm saying to God, have you got something to say to the church? Please, I'd love it. Share something with me and I'll share it with them. I'm asking the question and taking on the responsibility. And I know I'm a leader, but I want to encourage everyone to do the same. Go to God, say, God, got a message for someone today? Got a message to church today? I'd love to hear it. My life has been impacted by the prophetic in such a positive way. I would love to see that for others. I remember a time in my life in early 2009 when things were pretty rubbish for my family and I. Everything had gone wrong. For whatever reasons, it was a low point, and lots of people who know me know where we were at that moment. And me and Tanya got to one of those moments in where we just didn't know really what was going on. How do we carry on? It's just hurting, and our family's hurting, and we don't know what to do. And in the midst of that, Tanya prophesied, and she said that she really believed that God is speaking Isaiah 54 over us. And so we picked up and we read it together. Remember, we read Isaiah 54, and I remember just weeping. I remember just sobbing at these words, which they spoke directly into our lives. They made new promises over them. You know, every fear, concern and place and negativity and worry that I had before reading those words, I came away with the opposite. It was God speaking directly into our life. God's message to us. It gave us hope. It changed the atmosphere. It changed us. You know, I read these words this week that touched me by an American writer, theologian and minister by the name of Frederick Buechner. I'm going to read them to you now. For what we need to know, of course, is not just that God exists, not just that beyond the steely brightness of the stars there is cosmic intelligence of some kind that keeps the whole show going, but that there is a God right here in the thick of our day-by-day lives who may not be writing messages about himself in the stars, but in one way or another is trying to get messages through our blindness as we move around down here knee-deep in the fragrant muck and misery and marvel of the world. It is not objective proof of God's existence that we want, but the experience of God's presence. That is the miracle we are really after. And that is also, I think, the miracle that we really get. God is trying to get messages through our blindness. It is the wonder that we not only have a God that listens, but also one who speaks. I want to hear what God is saying. And I want him to speak into my situation continually today. I want to know what God has planned. I want to follow him and get there. For these reasons, I want to earnestly seek the gift of prophecy, and I would suggest and recommend the same for you all. I believe part of what God is doing right now is empowering his people to move forward, empowering them to be able to respond to this world, earnestly seek to hear his voice, his mind, his message. It will draw us closer to him and explode outwards to where God leads. Thank you. Bye.
I cast my mind to Calvary, where Jesus bled and died for me. I see his wounds, his hands, his feet, my Savior on that cursed tree. His body bound and drenched in tears, they laid him down in Joseph's tomb, high entrance sealed by heavy stone, Messiah still and all alone. Oh, praise the name of the Lord our God. Oh, praise his name forevermore. For endless days we will sing your praise. Oh Lord our God. On the third at break of dawn, the Son of Heaven rose again. Oh, tremble death, where is your sting? The angels roar for Christ the King. Oh, praise
that's it for today. I hope you feel energised and uplifted by John's talk. Have a fabulous week, and we welcome you next time. God bless.